Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of our participants and those of you who are joining us on Zoom. I hope this time finds you doing well, healthy, and being productive as we come to the holiday season and year's end. My name is Victor Valentine, and I am the Executive Director of the National Human Services Assembly. And I want to, again, welcome you to our convening, our webinar entitled, What About Funding? NHSA's Convening on the State of Philanthropy. Before I get started, I want to just briefly introduce today's panelists, and then we'll also give them an opportunity to tell you a little bit more about themselves and their work. First is Satonya Fair, President and CEO of Peak Grantmaking, and we have Susan Schaefer, Founder and Principal of Resource Partners LLC. I'm excited to have them both. They are both very strong and dynamic leaders in the sector, and hopefully through the conversation we have today, you'll learn some things, you'll get some tips, you'll get some pointers, some behind the curtain type of information that can kind of help position you and your organizations to access resources that can help you further your mission and make the impact in the communities that you're hoping to make. Before I go back to them, I kind of want to give you a little bit of background on who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. The National Human Services Assembly has been around since 1923. So in a little bit over a year from now, we'll be celebrating our centennial. We've remained a leading voice in supporting the human service sector. We are a membership organization. Many of our members are a cross-section of organizations that are touching every corner of the country. We have both large, medium, and small organizations associated with us. Organizations you may have known, like the National Community Action Partnership, the Building Movement Project, the Boys and Girls Club of America, the American Red Cross. And so, among others, we come together primarily to both lead and support. And we do believe in a leadership through supporting our organizations. We, as an umbrella organization and a convener of these organizations, our staff here are working primarily to support our industry in four primary areas. Those areas are capacity building for the human services sector, which is what this session falls under. We are very committed to racial equity, cultural diversity, and inclusion for all peoples. We have planted our flag in the cement on youth justice and diversion strategies. And with all things, once you have, experts and energy and expertise in the room, you should be working in public policy advocacy and education so that we can do two things: protect our ability to continue to provide the valuable services to our community, but more importantly, to give voice to the communities and the people that we're serving. So with that said, I kind of want to go back and once again reintroduce our panelists who I'm excited to have today. Again, Satonya Fair, President and CEO of Peak Grantmaking. She brings more than 25 years of work in philanthropy and nonprofit management. And as an anecdote, she and I have worked together in times past around responsible philanthropy and grant making. I know her to be a very strong, dynamic, and forceful person in the industry. I just want to hand it over to you real quickly, Satonya, to tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days and more about Peak Grantmaking.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate being invited to join you all today. Peak Grantmaking is an organization that's celebrating its 25th anniversary, so we're nowhere near a centennial just yet, but it has been a beautiful milestone year for us as an organization. Our goal every day is to center equity. We're not an equity organization, but we center our work and our principles and our values in equity and around racial equity. And so for us, it's about making sure that all of the people who consider themselves funders, we talk about philanthropy all the time, but that's really, like, there's a term with a definition. people who engage in funding nonprofits in different efforts in community, we know that all of our intentions can be great, but the way we practice grant making can really go against those intentions. And so we center around 5 principles that help funders get to efficient, effective, and equitable grant making practices. And so all day, every day, we're preaching for you all to have less issues in getting funds for your organizations. And so we try to be a bit of a spokesperson as well as just like a huge bullhorn on get your practices right, because nonprofits are doing great work. The leaders in those organizations are really tied to community, and funders should make it easier to be supported and not harder. So that's a little bit about Peak and what I do all day with my 500 plus members. But it's been joyful work and really, really blessed to have learned all that I did along the way, so that now, as I sit in this seat, I'm able to bring my nonprofit and social service and human service experience now into this role. So it's been exciting. Thank you.
That's fantastic. No, thank you. And also joining us is Susan Schaefer. She is the founder and principal at Resource Partners LLC. Susan comes to us with a vast amount of experience, expertise, and energy, not just as a consultant in the space, but a practitioner and thought partner. And so I want to give Susan a chance. Please tell us a little bit about what's happening in your world.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you today. And Satonya, I wanted to give you a standing ovation when I heard the issues you're working on right now, all the things that as a lifelong fundraiser in this space, I've been passionate about, and I think we all want to help advance in our own respective careers. I did spend time as a frontline fundraiser, mostly in the space that we'll largely be talking about today, and that is private funding on the corporate and foundation side, and worked last at the United Negro College Fund. And so education and especially health and human services are very much in my wheelhouse, particularly youth development as well. So you're hearing a theme, I think, from all of us today. And as a consultant now for 20 years, this is exactly my 20th year by the month, actually. Wow. So yes, it's been quite a journey. And really my emphasis continues to be in that health and human services space, especially with groups that have a national focus and in this very area that I like to call major grants. So private funding and helping nonprofits figure out where they excel and where they can fit in. I've done it as a board member at Johns Hopkins University, teaching some courses there, and just so passionate about working with people who have been my peers all along to help you do the very important work that you all do who are on the line today. So thanks again for having me.
No, thank you. I'm excited. Sounds like we got the right people at the table for this conversation. So yeah, let's kind of just jump into it. I think that the first question I'd like us to consider is really around what I believe, going and talking to many of the members in our network. We're coming up on the beginning of the year. We've had some challenges and opportunities presented to us because of the pandemic and the social unrest throughout our country. But those are present day issues, some of which have some historical context, but we have a lot of issues that we're still addressing as a sector. In 2022 going forward, where do you both see as the opportunity for organizations in the human service sector to position themselves, particularly to focus on increasing their financial support, so that those organizations who are looking to sustain, because we have taken major hits in some cases, there's turnover within the sector, but also because this also is a time that presents a great opportunity. Bottom line is that the human service sector is the sector that's poised and ready to address many of these concerns and challenges. So I like to say it's our time, but how do we, maximize that opportunity? So I'll start with you, Susan, first. In your work with organizations, what are you advising leaders and organizations about where they need to kind of put their focus?
It's a lengthy list, let me admit that, but I feel like when we're talking especially about institutional philanthropy on the private side, probably applies to all philanthropy at this point, if we're being honest, But the idea of, now that we have really emerged from the depths of the pandemic, and we're starting to move to a place where we can begin to see down the path a little bit more, I really think that the idea of planning is such an important piece right now. And it comes in so many forms, right? It comes in strategic planning, looking at that big picture, but all the way down to program design, so that you can very clearly articulate to a funder what it is you plan to do. I don't want to belittle the idea that this is just something we can all easily undertake, because let's admit it takes a lot of time, especially because there are so many areas within which we could do planning. And also because so many of our plans have been ruffled a bit by the last 18 months. So I think figuring out where your organization needs to begin on that process. Can you pick up from some pieces of a strategic plan that might have gotten a little bit ruffled, and revise it and move forward with some more detailed action plans? The reason I focus on this so much with the clients and even the boards on which I serve is that I think that funders can see very easily, these are professionals, of course, so they can see what ideas have really gone through a process, and the ones that frankly are still a little bit raw from lack of having been fully thought through. And so the more you can bring them ideas where they are not only thought out, but let's admit they want something bold. And I think the larger your organization gets, in my opinion, I'll be interested to hear Satonya's take on this. I think the bolder the ideas sometimes need to be, because it's become very tangible through the last 18 months, what a smaller organization can accomplish. And of course, there's a specificity to that funders can grasp onto very easily. And of course, sometimes at the national level, it's a little more difficult to pull out that kind of tangible detail. But let's admit, there are human beings reading these proposals and in these meetings, and they can best attach themselves to that level of detail. And so that's why I get us back to that planning idea again, because that's the point at which you can take those bigger ideas and work them down to the point where you are able to provide some very tangible examples. So I think there's lots of directions we could take here, but my biggest takeaways, I think, that I've just had endless conversations about with clients and peers in the last several months is around planning and the larger the organization, especially being bold.
Thank you. That sounds great. So Tanja, how does that hit with you, and what are your thoughts around this issue and the members in your organization?
So I'm going to pick up on two words and things that Susan said. One being people, and two being bold. And here's where I'm going from here. Peak Grantmaking supports philanthropy, but we're a nonprofit. So we do have our own experience that we're coming into this, a fundraising experience, a multi-million-dollar budget and a very small staff. I believe that it's going to be very important for human services organizations, really all nonprofits, but particularly you all have been responsible for saving lives, saving communities, and do not shy away from ensuring that a potential funder, whether that's an individual, a wealthy person in your community who's looking to fund some new work, or is just coming into being like a major philanthropist in community, or if it's a traditional private foundation that happens to come into your sites as a potential funder of your work, it's that people, your people, are the doers, not the funders. And so it's so important for you to position yourselves and your people and your own story around why supporting your organization is so critical. I think we immediately go to impact. I think we immediately go to say, look at my widgets and numbers. And I think that's critical, because most funders are looking to hear that you have thought about, through that strategic planning process, how to articulate the impacts that you are having in community. But I do believe that it is so critical to point out that without the people within your organization who are humans, often undercompensated and undervalued because you do not have what you need to support them. This is where we're getting a lot of funders to really start to think about the more unfettered grant making, more general operating support. And hey, if people are uncomfortable with that, you can put a label and call it capacity building programmatic support with stipulations that you can only use that money to build yourselves, build your technology, build your capacity, get mobile, get into the communities where you mostly serve. All those things are critically important, but I think funders are waiting to hear about your story. And I think that's so important. And with regard to being bold, I think it's bold to remind folks that you all are dealing with crisis every day, pandemic every day. Yes, there's been a pandemic, but there's been a crisis in communities. Looking at all the different members that belong to this assembly, you all are dealing with crises at the individual level and community level, and really at the national level every day. And you know that work better than anyone. Don't let anyone fool you into thinking that you don't. You are the experts for sure. And so I do think that the boldness of being able to say, our organization has been in community for this period of time, and these are the types of things that we have supported. I do think that funders really want to hear those stories. And I think it's important for you to move beyond what the grant application or what you believe the spiel needs to be to get the funding and really focus on your own stories. I would also say it's so great to bring in an emissary, which is community. Who are you helping? Make sure those voices are present, even in your ask in your meetings. You can prepare someone and really make sure they're well supported to be able to either lift up their own story or talk about how your organization has really impacted them. I think that funders want to hear more of that. Right? We get a bit rote sometimes in asking for money. We have our own routine. We've had our proposal that got funded. So we go right back to that and say, this is a similar process. Let me do this. I do think that funders want to hear kind of some new ideas, but I would just encourage you to center yourselves. People will support your capacity more, the more they understand the humans doing the work and the humans being impacted in community. So that is huge, but I also know that there's an emphasis right now in wanting to hear how organizations are partnering to solve problems. And I think that funders are often listening to what are you doing and who are you working with in order to push the needle or to advance something in community. So I do think that partnership thing, funders are often wondering that they're often asking themselves, do we have enough money, right, to support the myriad of issues that are within our strategies?
That's fair.
And I think it's really important for them to just hear that you've thought about like partners and how you're coming together with those partners to plan and strategize. To what Susan's saying is that you're not doing it alone. And I do think that funders are looking for that almost as a buzzword when they come and talk to organizations and consider funding opportunities. So those are a few things that are sitting with me. People, be bold, make sure that you're bringing in community voice, talking about your impact, you've been doing it, and also ensuring that you're thinking about how are we positioning ourselves with like partners in this work.
I love it when, the subsequent questions are really going to touch on the very subjects that we started off talking. And I'm very encouraged to hear that, what you're seeing in the space, talking to funders, is that they're willing to and looking to listen to those stories and utilizing the expertise, the experience of the folks the boots on the ground, so to speak, who are getting the work done, who have the trust of the communities that they're working in first and foremost. And so I'm happy to hear that. I'd want to mine that a little bit more with the second question about, how do you make that pitch? And the reason I asked that is that, and there was a push sometime, as you might both know, but the participants may not. I have a background in philanthropy myself, and there was a strong push in years past to get more data focused, to streamline applications, to put them online. And so now it's almost as if you're putting in a job application for thousands and sometimes $1 million of grants. So there's not an opportunity with 500-word restrictions in blocks. to be able to tell those stories. And to be able to bring those advocates and those partners who can speak about that. So can you kind of dig a little bit deeper on how can that work happen when, one, that power dynamic in many cases still exists between funders and grantees? We've gone to data and efficiency as a means and a process for gathering information so that you're keeping your process pretty standard, that I can compare apples to apples when you're sitting on a review team from an RFP. But we need to go beyond that. Because how do we know who's got the best practice? How do we know who's doing the best work? Who, if you invest in them, can take their work to scale to touch more folks and then ultimately be held up as a standard for others? So can you speak a little bit more on how to navigate what we have in many cases as a cold process to kind of warm it up? And Satonya, I'll start with you.
Oh, a cold process that we need to warm up. I'm holding that one and I'm going to repeat that. So I will say, as an accidental technologist in the space of grant making, my career started in nonprofits, but then moved over to philanthropy. That has been the biggest challenge, is that if you are a small fund, a small funder, a large funder, it's just, there is almost like a sense of overwhelm that comes with the job in philanthropy. And so we have moved to technology, like you said, just like an HR firm might, to try to scan through the many people who want our dollars. Some organizations have definitely appropriately, I don't think this is a bad thing all the time, but they've moved to invitation only, right? Because they decided that they just didn't want to be creating false hope for organizations. When you have open-ended processes where you say, if you're mission aligned or if you're advancing these things, apply for a grant, and you have all these all these proposals that come in, and there's no way based on the dollars or anything else that you can actually fund that. I have definitely just been like, you need to be super transparent. So one of the things that I think warms up the process, right? And I just want to give you an anecdote. Recently, we have like a community, an online community, and we've been sharing stories and truly trying to help people think out of the box. During the pandemic, all of the application reporting process and all the other stuff, we just needed to drop all of that and move money. And I felt like the grants managers who are at the center of Peak's work were ready for that. We've been talking about more simplified human contact ways of moving dollars for a long time, but we too were stuck in the fact that people's job descriptions in philanthropy, whether in finance, a program officer or grants manager or the CEO, it has a lot of administrative crap in it. And people really get stuck in their job descriptions and like, I'm a finance person and I've got to make sure all the check boxes are checked. We have to also be doing a lot of inside work with our colleagues within philanthropy to just remind them that your value is not changed when we move faster. And when there is no report at the end of this, like we still will get information from our nonprofits that we fund, we'll get that. But right now is not the time for your process to be above your purpose. And so we've definitely, count on organizations like Peak Grantmaking to be behind the scenes, just stirring it up and making sure that people understand that your process is indeed cold and a bit inhuman. And these are humans out here doing the work. And so we quote Boulay all the time, fund the people, fund the people, fund the people. Remember that the people have all that they need to help you understand what they're doing on the ground. And so I do think that there has been, we were really excited that we heard very organically from about 100 different funders that they wanted to go to oral reporting. And so there are some bright spots out there. All I have to say is that there are groups of people who are saying there are new ways of ensuring that we're hearing from our grantees differently. And I do think that people recognize the fact that a lot of nonprofits are seen as seekers. We're takers, right? It's this weird dynamic of going back to the power piece. And it's just like, no, we are nonprofit partners, because you can have all the money in the world, but you don't do the thing. That's what we do. And so if I do a thing and you can help fund it, that's called a partnership. But it has been a lot of work to get more funders into a trust place with nonprofits and to understand that this truly is a partnership. I'm not a grant seeker. You're not a grant maker. let's be partners, and so because we're both trying to just advance something in community. So I do think that subject matter expertise that I know that every organization is bringing to the table, sometimes there's other people that you need to be your best advocate. I know that's what Peak tries to do every day. And we have a whole group of other organizations that don't try to speak on your behalf. You can speak best for yourself, but we have a nice opportunity to tell philanthropy when it's messing everything up. And we try to make sure we do that with respect and love and give them a path forward. And this partnership piece has been really, really important. I actually don't even use the term grantee often. I say nonprofit partner. And when I'm speaking to nonprofits, I remind them that you are a nonprofit corporation, run like a business, and you'll have success, because you can have all the heart in the world, but people are expecting some things on the other side that relate to your finance, your impact, all the stuff that you need to get right to be a really strong functioning nonprofit. And for people to have confidence in your work and that you're going to do what you say that you do. But I just believe that the pandemic has opened up an opportunity because we needed to move fast for us to talk more. And I believe that that's that hold the line kind of thing. We need to continue to push funders to really keep the warmth as they go through it, and don't go back to being this cold person behind the wall or unfeeling institution because you think that the crisis is over. Crises are never over. And so keep that opportunity of staying in connection and in relationship with your nonprofit partners and with the communities. So that's something that we're really pushing and advancing, but I know that it is a struggle for nonprofits to say that on their own behalf and hear the funder. It's a vulnerable time to say, please see me as the doer when you're looking for funding for your work. And so that's why people like Peak and probably Susan, Vic, all of us, we're trying to make sure that we are reminding philanthropy of its opportunity areas all the time.
That's incredible. So I gave you one, and I'm going to take one from you. So Susan, while you react to that and kind of share your thoughts on it, I'm going to try to change my slide from partners versus grantees to partners and nonprofit partners. But Susan, what do you say about that?
I love that. I love that. And it's funny, Satonya, that you went where you did on that question, because I've often found myself, of course, I'm talking more frequently to the nonprofit partners in this equation, and I find myself emphasizing many of those same points you just talked about, but in reverse, that remember that the funders are also people, because I think it's easy to forget that we are dealing with individuals. And of course, when there are major donors, that's part of it's worked into the fabric, right, of individual giving, of major gifts for sure. But once you move to that institutional side, I think it's easy to forget, because you see the name of an organization. There are many of us on this line, let's admit, that have tried to reach a human being, maybe for months or years, and have not succeeded. So increasingly, it feels like we're not dealing with a person. Maybe it does feel like we're dealing with technology, or just some castle wall that we will never be able to surmount. So I really try to emphasize and re-emphasize to the groups I work with, and certainly did it, my own when I was a frontline fundraiser, that there are people on the other end, and that yes, let's acknowledge the overwhelm is there on both ends of the equation, but that there is really an opportunity, I think, to think about particularly folks at foundations and our corporate funders in the same way we think about individual donors. Because there is often, when I see nonprofit systems and how they spell out the way in which they will communicate with an institution, a funding institution, over the course of the year, there is, let's admit, a tendency to contact these funders in the weeks or even days leading up to a deadline. And that is probably the point at which there is maximum overwhelm for that program officer, the program staff. And so it's not an ideal time to reach out to them unless you already have an existing relationship with them. And I know, given a lot of the things that we all know, and that Satonya re-emphasized, that these are busy people and they're already not answering my calls. How will I ever break that barrier down? And I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So let me just say for now that I think the best thing you can do is make those gains, and they're easier to do, of course, when you are outside of that immediate application deadline, or board season. You know, if they're rolling deadlines because of board meetings, trying to move outside of that a bit, so that you're at a point where the program staff has some space at a foundation, and that I know we're going to talk about this too, but you find some commonalities outside of the application itself, and really emerge as a person approaching another person who can serve as partners, as Satonya said so well, and work in the same field toward the same goals. So I really do try to set up systems with my clients that encourage them to contact funders year round. That doesn't mean every month necessarily. It doesn't mean that you have to expect them to attend all of your events, or expectations, I think, can vary, let's say that, but that you just develop a relationship that is not based on the application cycle. And then within that, I think part of the way to begin some of these conversations and create more opportunities for yourself and be more collaborative. This gets back to our first question a little bit, but is to talk about some of the things that are not typically asked by the foundation. So if you see that application, or even if it's an individual giver and you know a funder, and you know the questions they tend to ask, there may be other things that you've been dying to express. And so I think sometimes the successful collaborations address the unasked questions. So you may know that a foundation prioritizes advocacy, or even metrics and outcomes and things that this foundation is known for, but there may be something your organization is doing very well that you just simply don't get asked by a funder. So I think trying to make some space for those unasked questions in your conversations, even in your written applications, opens the door to some honesty and some candor to say, I know you're not asking this, but boy, am I dying to tell you what we are doing on this level, because it does affect the people, the crisis at hand, whatever it may be. And I think it's just a really nice way to show them that you are thinking beyond the standard framework, and that you're looking to develop a relationship. And implicitly, you're also then informing the funder on what else they might be looking at in future application cycles and from other nonprofits.
Yeah, I think you're describing the cover letter, Susan, to Vic's example about it's like applying for a job. If you put your resume in for a job and you don't attach a cover letter, you're missing the most golden one-page opportunity to talk about all of it. And I think that's what we're talking about, has to come into that relationship and the other things that you are sharing in the relationship building with a potential funder or a current funder. I think, Susan, you said something also that I think it sparked something for me. You all have had support from other people already. If you're asking for money from a private foundation, go to another foundation that's already supported you and ask them if they can be part of the connecting, because you may not be able to get anyone on the phone. But I'm telling you, in 20 years in philanthropy, I knew everybody else was funding like things, and I could get Vic on the phone. And so the other thing is, how do you ensure that you're working through other current funders or prospective funders that have great relationships with you, even past funders, to be, again, a bit of a bridge for you in those relationships. So I would definitely encourage that.
I really appreciate what both of you shared there. And as you were both talking, I'm hearing the word cultivation. We are so I would say programmed in many cases in our nonprofits and our human services organizations to speak in terms of crises. That if we don't do something now, or if we don't address this now, we're losing people. We're going to be in danger of moving into a crisis internally as an organization. But taking a step back and thinking more cultivation versus crises is the wave that we need to get on, because we are. And my next question is really going to talk about, you mentioned some of the barriers, and we talked a little bit about potential barriers to creating these relationships. We've got a huge one facing us right now, and it's that we're not even having this meeting in person. It's that we are little squares on the side of a big square, and that, we've got this virtuality and this virtual reality that we're dealing with, which is one more, I would say, both a blessing and a curse from my perspective, of how to, that's in the way of doing business, or that we have an opportunity to do business. Because we are in this situation, we're not at meetings and we're not at functions where you can network both before and after. There are no more passing of business cards and follow up later. We are here in this moment in time, and I'm sure everyone who is on this call, as soon as this session is over, if hopefully they're taking a mental health break, they're going to go eat lunch, and then they're going to hop on to the next 15 Zoom meetings that are scheduled for today while thinking about the ones tomorrow. It makes it very difficult in some cases to develop, specifically new relationships, with program officers, with funders, and even cultivating the relationships of those who might be able to walk you in those virtual spaces. I love the fact that you mentioned that if you're already being funded by someone in the same space, that utilize that relationship and leverage that relationship to get you that next meeting. I would also say, and here is my plug for your boards, to have your board members who might have relationships. And the membership organization specifically, we have members, for us, particularly, we have members who are receiving funding, but, where there's opportunity to connect, to collaborate, to go in the office and go into that meeting together, seek out those things. There's a process I won't get to, too deeply, but you need to do some power mapping. And power mapping is at its base, finding who's the person next to the person next to the person. How do I get next to the person who can get me to that person? Where are those places, spaces, and faces that I need to engage to get that 5-minute conversation, and hopefully we can set up a Zoom meeting. But I want to hear from you all, because that's one of the ways that I've gone about as a nonprofit leader, going about trying to get in rooms where I may not have the primary relationship. But what are you all seeing in that space of how we're navigating both this challenge and what I would also call an opportunity? And Susan, I'll start with you.
Sorry about that. Yes, I think we've touched on some of them already. The idea of warm introductions is huge. So that means keeping track of who you know, and making sure that you are mapping who those people know and asking them regularly who they know. There maybe is no better way, whether you're in a remote world or not, right? So I think the translation is similar, virtual and otherwise. So as we hopefully begin to come out more and more from this remote world, I think that always holds, the warm introductions and making sure that you're constantly taking stock of who is in your circles, your organization circles, and moving from there. I think for me, maybe the best thing to come out of this, this remote piece has been one idea that I thought was always important, but has just risen to the top. And that is, especially for the kind of organizations where this audience works, that is serving as a resource for funders, because that goes back to some things we've talked about already, getting yourself out of the conversations around a specific application or application cycle, and offering to be a support to the funder. And it works. I think it translates whether you are a local, regional, or national organization, because you find the funders that have a mission interest that's aligned with yours. And I have been involved in so many instances, whether it was myself as the frontline fundraiser or working alongside a client, where we have found ways to offer the subject matter expertise of colleagues, or let's face it, if you're in the development field, you just absorb some of that just by being around so many smart people in your field, and serving as a resource. And I'll just tell a quick story about one of my own opportunities in that realm, which is that when I took a development job and was making my early rounds, doing the perfunctory calls to everyone and saying, hello, I'm Susan Schaefer, I'm the new foundations lead. And one of them was just livid with my organization. And I was not at all prepared. Who ever expects that sort of thing? So I braced myself for a few moments and let her vent. And yeah, I had absolutely no history about the things she was upset about, but let her talk. And by the end of the conversation, there was nothing I could say except for the idea that I was obviously sorry she felt the way she did and experienced what she did. There was really nothing to remedy what she was discussing at that point. So I empathized and then let her know that as she moved forward, this being a senior program officer at a very well-known foundation, I said, I want you to still know that we and I are here for you if there's anything we can do as you move forward, because I know that you are very prominent in your area and we're doing a lot of work that might help inform your work. So I hope that even without funding, because I think she did use the words that we will, you should not expect any funding from us ever, was pretty good translation. And so I still offered us as a resource, and she took us up on that offer. I mean, took me up on it. I'd spend many days running down the hall to get information from my colleagues who knew more than I did. But she was using some of our resources to educate herself and therefore her board and some colleagues about some grant making. And lo and behold, I think we got a check one year toward the end of the year, which I considered a token of appreciation, which from a foundation that size was a nice sized grant, and did nothing to receive it in terms of application or whatnot. And it wasn't long after that we became annual nonprofit partners. So it was my first real insight into the way that those kind of resource-based relationships could play out. And I see that as an absolute opportunity in this virtual world, because I think we are all struggling a little bit to figure out, okay, my old resources currently are not yet back to where they were. I don't have all the conferences and convenings and all that where I can have coffee with all of the varied partners where I used to do that so easily. So offering that up, I think, is a huge advantage.
Appreciate that. So Tanja, what do you say about that? Are there opportunities for meet the funders over coffee?
So I'll just tell you, and this may, it is not meant to sound counter, but I have now been raising money for so many years. I mean, literally for the last 25 years for things I care about. And so I'm so used to, as a board member, being engaged, because Vic needs me to go out with him. And as a board member, I'm going out on that ask for whatever else. I've spent a lot of time working in philanthropy and nonprofits on planes, trains, and automobiles going to meetings. This has been a blessing. I'm so sorry. Let me just say,
I believe there's
Zoom
opportunity.
is free. It is free. And I just want to just encourage you all that sometimes the biggest disruptors in our lives pose opportunities that we could have never asked for or activated on like this. I think about education. I've done a lot of work peripherally with tons of universities and funding them and seeking them as a resource. Susan, when I think about that work that I've done, I said the pandemic is going to upend tenure, and it's going to upend how we raise money. And if for the nonprofits, the 1.5 million plus organizations that consider themselves to be nonprofits, if we do not walk out of this leaning into this Zoom screen in very different ways. I just had 3 meetings with the MacArthur Foundation. I think about whether me and my team and my one board member, who's also in DC, I'm located in the Baltimore, DC area. If I had to get on a plane and go speak first to this person and then the next group. And then the next, I think about all of that and just my fundraising line item. Remember, I am a nonprofit. My fundraising line item, just my travel alone in traditional years. And I'm new on this job, but I've been on the board. I was on the board for years. So I've been looking at our financials very deeply for a long time and encouraging my predecessor, get out there, go meet with the people, build these relationships. I have for almost a zero line item, no travel was allowed. And we have been no in person, not even locally through this year. And so I have been able to send love notes in 10 seconds. For instance, a funder who is off cycle for us right now. So they've just done their last grant payment to us on a multi-year grant done or whatever else. They lost their founder. She passed away. And I remember I sent a note and I said, really sorry to hear this news or whatever else. Ended up getting into an inadvertent dialogue with the CEO of the foundation. And then all of a sudden I noticed that he was like putting me like on his list of things about his board. I'm not on his board. And he's not funding us right now. Out of nowhere, a connection was formed from a simple email that I sent, thanking him for his past support, noting that this must be a loss for the organization and wishing them well as they kind of like found their new footing, right? And having lost their founder. And so from that perspective, I have just been using the most simple ways, the quick coffee chat. Oh my God, I have 20-minute coffee chats on Fridays with so many different people, but current funders, prospective funders. When people reach out to us and say, hey, Satonya, we're really interested in Peak's principles. We're a membership organization. If you're not a member, like I am only one person, I can only be in so many places. And so we in the past would say to a non-member, we don't have time to talk to you. Like you need to be a member to get Peak. Like we're stretched thin. You know what? As a CEO, I have just decided to lean into this opportunity. I have a ton of expertise in my head. I can be the resource. I cannot ask that of my team right now. We're all under-resourced. We're all underfunded as far as like the people side. But I said as CEO, even if I got paid $1, I'm leaning into this Zoom screen right now. And I'm going to send a ton of little notes. When we have a publication or a blog that goes out or an article that mentions Peak, I grab that link and I send it really quick. No, like multiple paragraphs. No. Hey, Vic, hope you saw this article. Had a great mention about something we talked about capacity building. Would love to chat with you soon. Boom, done. And I am literally positioning myself without a travel line item, and my fundraising expenses have gotten very low. What I told the team was like, as the normal $400,000 we would spend on fundraising goes down like to zero, we are using that for other things. And so also it's important to show your funders how you're kind of repositioning in fundraising and relationship building and resource building. To Susan's point, it's really important for you to position that in your cover letter to, as you get these relationships going, because this has been a moment for us. But if we go and can get back on planes and trains, and we go back to doing fundraising exactly the way we did it before, with this expectation that you're going to go to the Ford Foundation and have the big meeting all day and you're paying for your hotel and you're paying for your flight. Maybe they give you $5,000 or $3,000 or $1,000 to cover your time. What? That is not the norm. And so I've just said, like, this crisis of the pandemic and us not being able to travel should upend in the most amazing way fundraising for nonprofits moving forward. So I just try to I'm tired, I'm exhausted, but I know that my role is to write that little email, send that little note, send the link to the publication, blah, 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 and then try to take the weight off my team so they can continue to do the work. So I've just leaned into this moment. I know we have lots of different roles represented on this call, but I think that this has been, I could have never been in all these cities. I could have never met with all the funders that I've connected with over the last 18 months. I just couldn't have done it. And so I'm just grateful. I am grateful that there wasn't a plane or train ticket associated with all the things. And a ton of these people, 80% of these people are not giving Peak money. But it's about that relationship building, which you have to be vested in, whether it results in a grant or not, because that relationship is how they begin to rely on you, to Susan's point, that this person has some expertise that we can lean on. And then it usually leads to some type of funding or relationship, which I think is beautiful, but it could take years. This Zoom screen allows you to do that for free.
That's right.
And an email is also free. So lean into it, guys. Lean into it. Don't see this as the tragedy of our world. I think that God gave us a gift.
Fair
I
enough.
want to say quickly,
Sure, Susan.
I couldn't agree more. And I just want to add to your list of benefits that not only are you able to do these things for less money and contact more people, but I have watched so many nonprofits increase the depth of their relationships because of this free, no cost communication, and the fact that we can now more easily do 10-minute face-to-face calls. So
Right.
my both clients and organizations on whose boards I serve and advise are also spending a lot of time with short, maybe the equivalent, Satonya, of your 20-minute coffees. They are doing that repeatedly with organizations over time and getting to know them more deeply, getting to see how things are evolving behind the scenes and get a little more insight than they would certainly in person. So I do think even if there eventually will be, and there probably will be, some more in-person meetings, because that's the way people operate, I think this ability to continue the conversation in brief, one-off video conversations is huge. I cannot tell you the amount of insights that I have gotten just from being able to peek in to a 10-minute conversation with the funders as they're having the conversation and they just want us for a few minutes. And so I think that opportunity also should be something that nonprofits should, to use your words, to lean into, because we can also suggest those as we're putting our budgets together, or that big plan that we're working on, to get a funder's insights briefly. And so I think that's another way to get in the door, because you're not asking for an hour, you're not asking for a lunch, you're asking for 15 minutes.
Yeah,
so yes,
absolutely.
Opportunities abound. So I just want to reflect that positivity that there are
and
a lot
I
of
would,
things coming out of this.
I would add that in my own experience recently, as I've taken the chair that I'm in now, is I think you just hit on something that I want to hit on a little more, is we can become co-creators a little bit better with our funders, with this space. Again, sometimes we're off cycle when we're making those asks or we're trying to make those meetings. Of course, we all have our missions and our visions and those places that we want to make real positive impact, but it's worth having these conversations with funders and asking them, within the context of our mission alignment, where do you think we should be? How do you think we should position ourselves? What's even the best way for us to approach you when it's time to approach you, and really starting to develop the relationship? So I'm so very excited to hear, looking at the moment, as you called it, Satonya, that we're in, as an opportunity, because we do have some time back. To ourselves, to our lives, and to our professions. And we do have opportunities to get and cut to the chase very quickly. You mentioned 15-minute coffee meetings. Being able to, I don't want to call it the old paradigm of the 30-second elevator speech, but the 15-minute Zoom conversations. Maybe, that's the direction. I want to, now that we've kind of talked about how we need to conceptualize building these relationships, presenting ourselves as experts, utilizing and leaning into the technology. Now, many of us might be at the point of making an ask, but going all the way back to the beginning, and I've heard as a theme through all of the conversation, that we're putting people alongside of processes, alongside of product, alongside purpose. And so the last question is about general operating support, and really helping funders see capacity building, as we renamed it, as a critical component for moving the work forward, and not just the overhead, the typical overhead percentage. How do we move away from that to get funders to see investing in the people is investing in the purpose? And not to say that that's not happening, but we're still seeing caps We mentioned you. I mean, I heard Susan mention very astutely about, I think both of you did, planning. So yeah, it's one thing to talk about we've planned and we've planned well, and this is the purpose we think we can accomplish. But sometimes we need money for the planning itself. What's the conversations around supporting the actual planning around some of these strategies? And if that's still a moving target, how do we nail that down so we can hit that bullseye? And I'll start first with you, Susan.
Yeah, this is a very timely conversation because right before this this call started, I got a note from one of my clients who had received restricted funding for years from a foundation, and I'm so thrilled to report that this year, post-pandemic, as we're calling it, they received an unrestricted grant, and they really made the case for it. They had to work for it, so I don't want to give the impression that the sky is falling right now with unrestricted grants in a way that it wasn't before. But I think, as many of you know, there were a lot of funders who were willing to make emergency unrestricted grants during the pandemic. I saw lots of those, and many of them were very generous. So I don't want to take that away from the funding community. I am seeing now a lot of reversal back to some restricted funding. And but in this example that I can say literally happened this morning, I think there is an openness that where we all need to continue the drumbeat. Let's be honest about that, because it has been, it's nothing revelatory to suggest that everyone's, especially human services organization, needs more unrestricted funding. But I think part of the conversation here, well, let's admit, first of all, that in this particular grant, which I might as well use as a little case study, involves a lot of the things we've already talked about, involved a lot of short conversations over many months about why we needed to make this change. It did pick up, frankly, not only on the nonprofits planning, but also the foundation's planning. And this, it is a health and human services organization, happened to suggest, we talked a lot about this, kind of in the in-house team, that, as we know, this foundation, which was, making six-figure grants to this nonprofit, as they were going through, as the funder was going through its own strategic thinking, how can we as a nonprofit partner try to inform that, even though, well, the organization had been asked, the nonprofit had been asked to provide input. So, with all the craziness of the pandemic, that was, the foundation did not follow through. So we made sure that we pushed a little bit, a nice gentle nudge, I will call it, to make sure that we were heard anyway, because we wanted to make sure that they knew how important this unrestricted funding would be, because they had made a nice grant during the pandemic that was unrestricted, and what a gift that was in that moment. And that this moment would continue, as I think both Victor, you and Satonya have said, that these crises in different forms will, of course, persist. So we really did push a little bit to get a conversation. Again, it had nothing to do with a particular application, but just the theoretical thinking around the idea of what a difference that pandemic unrestricted grant made, and what an incredible difference ongoing unrestricted funding would make. And then when it did come time to submit the application, and I think you alluded to this, Victor, earlier, that the proposal didn't necessarily look a lot different, and the meetings did not necessarily sound a lot different than they would have in the previous form when we were specifically asking for restricted money. We were still very focused on goals and outcomes, and even, some very data-driven metrics. We were telling compelling stories and talking about planning and the people who had been involved in that planning, which was very extensive. So all of these are things that we would discuss anyway. And then you just put it under a different umbrella, right? You're talking about it as your daily daily goings on at your nonprofit. And so the conversation doesn't have to sound a lot different. The way I think I often couch it just by default is that our emphasis this year will be on X. And that's often the program area in which the funder prioritizes. And so there is really, I think, so much room for robust advocacy, frankly, to use a word that's possible, that's very popular right now. I think advocacy on all of our parts as to how much this issue, maybe more than anything else, matters when we're talking about the power dynamic, when we're talking about that idea of co-creators. I think that in this sector, this industry more than others, this health and human services space, we need the unrestricted funding. And let's face it, some funders are more aware of that need than others. So making sure that we are poking a little bit to figure out, okay, does this particular person I'm speaking with really understand the need for it? And how much might I need to educate that person and help them understand all of the details? And again, not by showing finances necessarily, but by telling stories, going through what things look like when we're even talking about the budget cycle and how much unrestricted funding might be lacking at the end of a year. So making the case for ourselves, I think, is very important and will be an ongoing piece here. But Satonya, I'm really interested.
Yeah, Satonya, what's your thoughts, first of all, on that, and also in your conversations with your members? How's that landing?
So we definitely, there's been a lot of reports that have come out. I know that there's never any time, right? But it's so important to there's certain reports coming out for the Center for Effective Philanthropy and other organizations, even the Council on Foundations, put out some what's happened during the pandemic, right? And one of the shifts that we have seen has been to easier processes to get more unrestricted funding out the door. And so it's happening, there's a trend, but still the percentage is quite low. When we think about there's thousands of funders, but when we think about the staffed foundations as a much smaller group, and they're still uncomfortable. And what I would say the reason why there's a lot of discomfort on just writing the check is because the relationships and trust have not been the hallmark of how we work together. And so I think everything we said and every question we've answered, Susan, Vic, and I have emphasized that trust, transparency, and reporting. You want to know, why aren't you being more transparent, funder? Be transparent. We put out things that I believe are very helpful. One, as a guide star, I'm a huge proponent of guide star. Most funders use it as an opportunity to see whether you're vetted. They're looking at your 990, our audited financials, and all of our strategic things are always updated on GuideStar. So technically, if there's even one person staffing that organization, I'm trying to make it easy for them to see Peak Story. It's out there. And also on our webpage, we do have a webpage. I have hired college students to design a webpage and all kinds of stuff. You've got to get that opportunity to just say hey, have a web presence, have your story out there. Because if I'm trying to figure out whether you've got the reputation to fund and the capacity and outcomes to fund blank check wise, if you're just telling me about that, if Susan has to call me and say, tell me about Peak, and she can't go out there and find our story somewhere, that's a problem. And so we do have to look introspectively at, are you putting out an annual report? Do you have quarterly strategic KPIs or anything that you report to your board on or to your members on or to the community on? How can you repackage that potentially as a story about your work? And I do think you have to make sure that you're breaking down the cost to do the work. Oftentimes your budget is not breaking down the cost to do the work, which is really the people story we've talked about and how you do your work through your people. So I have just found that as we built relationships and built trust, we got more blank checks as an organization. That has been my own story for Peak Grantmaking at other organizations where I was on the board or was raising money for those orgs. The trust and relationship building has to happen. You have to have your story out there. You have to have strong financials, because those things are all the things that they funders use as excuses to write a restricted grant. The other thing is, ask yourself, do you start with program or do you start with the work? Because if you start your proposal or your conversation with a potential funder talking about your program, that's where they're going. If you're talking about your work and your outcomes, that is where they will follow. And you should ask very directly, is your organization comfortable even with a smaller unrestricted grant? Because you should be able to also describe that the proposal costs this amount of money for my staff to complete. The reporting costs this amount of money for my staff to complete. Peak actually, this is crazy, don't tell anyone, we reject large process, small grants. I don't have a development officer. It's just me raising the money. I can't do the 15 reports. I can't. And when we get a staff that can do that, that's one thing, but I'm not saying that that's going to take up their time. And so we try to also remind a funder what our average grant is. Because I think that sometimes for a funder, they might be writing a $50,000 or $100,000 or even a $250,000 check. It's big for them. And then you go, our average grant is $500,000. So it's a lot of process for a lot smaller grant than we do. Tell your story. In telling your story, it's an aha moment to the funder or to the person you're talking to that, oh, you know what? It is a big grant for us, but thank you for the context that this is actually a smaller grant for your organization. What's your flexibility in us right sizing the process with you, like in being, again, the partner? But we really do push back. We really do push back and say, your restricted $5,000 grant with the 4 report requirements over the next 2 years is not going to work for us. But we do it with love, and we try to say our why. And we do that on behalf of every other nonprofit out there trying to raise money. So we self-sacrifice for better practices, but it is important to come with that data about your average grant, who's your average funder, how much do you bring in from individuals, what do you bring in from private foundations? Jeff Hale posted a great question on the Q&A about the Giving USA data, and I find that information so helpful. My team draws that information down every year, and we actually use the data from the Giving USA report around philanthropic giving, that 80% is still coming from direct service and the reimbursement from government. We use that and embed it in all of our presentations and resources, because we often find that our philanthropy members don't know the big story about philanthropy. They see philanthropy and they think, oh, we're giving trillions of dollars away. And I'm like, you are 4% of the giving picture. Make it good, but you're a very small picture, even against corporate. You're small. And so that is why philanthropy must have its craft together, so that the story, that 4% story, can be a good story, because it's so small in the grand scheme of how nonprofits get funded that philanthropy often gets kind of out of sorts with its importance. And so you have to have the 100 PSOs out there telling them, like, thank you, but put yourself in the box that is the right size for what you're doing versus what everyone else, and especially individuals. The checks you all write to your church, to your kids' school, to all that stuff. You are philanthropists every day going to work. You are also the fuel behind the fire of so many other nonprofit entities and good working community. You know what it's like to be a funder. So remember that when you go into those relationships and have and feel your power as someone who's fueling your own community, whether they see that or not, you have more information than you realize you have about what this landscape is. But you have to present a good story all the time so that the funder is not looking for information in real time to make them trust you and trust what you do. So there has to be an emphasis on having those annual reports and that data, those stories, those anecdotes at the ready and accessible all the time for whomever they send to do research on your organization. Because whoever it is, what are they going to find if they go do a search on like what kind of results you've had? So have your story together. That's a tough one, but I think it does warrant the less restricted grants, and it warrants you arguing on behalf of yourself to have less restricted grants when your impact story is very telling.
I appreciate that. If I could put a little bit of a bow in the few minutes that we have left, and I'm going to ask you both to share some final thoughts. But what I've heard more than over and over is this cultivation, it's almost an over communication to build that trust between, partners to, getting, so we can dispel the power dynamic and being very clear about who you are, what you're able to do, and what you can do with further investment. And so I'm really appreciating and encouraged by what I'm hearing coming from both of you, being in the space and having those conversations and having your ear to the ground. And I like the fact that there's this boldness that people are being encouraged to do, because quite honestly, in your last example, that hit me a little bit, because we've been again programmed to believe, take the $5,000 restricted grant with 4 reports over 2 years so I can get my foot in the door.
You spend more time on staff time than you did for that 5,000. And so it's really unfair. And
the return on investment is negative. It's not
negative.
Even, it's negative. So I appreciate that. That's going to take some work. It's going to take some time because sometimes that level of discomfort is a risk aversion that many people, many leaders still have. You don't want the door shut in your face. But what I would say about groups like Peak and groups like ours at the Assembly, these are areas where, in your case, funders can get together and talk about these things and really break through the myths, to talk in terms of how they can show up better, to use that colloquialism. And, as from the Assembly side, that advocacy, moving together as one, as a human services sector, to come up with common language and to promote things like more resources that go towards general operating supports, the capacity building. We're in positions to be able to do that. So one of the things that I would say in the closing thoughts is that this is the time, this is the opportunity for many of the folks who are participating on this call to get linked up. You're not alone, to get linked up with, folks like, the Assembly, get linked up with Susan, get linked up if you're a funder on the call with Peak Grantmaking, because we have to do something different than what we've been doing. Again, we're in this moment, we're in this space, and it is our moment to be the conduit and the front line for bringing positive change in some very troubling times that our country is facing. So at the end of all of this, we've talked practice and we've talked process, but it always comes down to people. And we can't forget that each data point that we're talking about represents some level of a human touch. Depending on how far away it is, it might be direct or indirect. So those are kind of what I would leave folks with. Satonya, what would you like to say in closing before we jump off this call?
I know that there is both an amazing opportunity and a vulnerability. That's what we exist every day as nonprofits. We have so many great ideas and so much passion that we're bringing into the work. And we just wish that the people who were our funders saw it, right? And could see that a little bit more readily without an explanation. But I would just say that I work in philanthropy and supporting philanthropy because I'm extremely optimistic. But where I'm most excited is that I believe that the nonprofit voice is being heard and amplified and lifted up in ways that I have never quite seen. And for us, we do remind funders, our own, as well as those in the wider sector, that you must tie your practices to your values. And there's a series of questions you should be asking yourself. The nonprofit should not have to put them to you. But let's ask ourselves, are you operating in ways that tie your intention and mission to your practice and your values? And so it is everything I do in Scolding is with love and with mad respect for the role that funders play and philanthropists play in this ecosystem. But I would just say be encouraged. We should be coming out of this with 1 million new ideas and tricks and innovations for how we support ourselves and our teams and how we support this sector, because it is critically important is an economic driver. We remember that we employ a huge percentage of the American population in this field. So just know your story, tell your story, and be bold about it, right? Be super bold about it. And to Vic's point, you are not alone. You must be in peer connection at all times. We matter when we stand as a coalition and as a group and in solidarity. It makes all the difference. I know that's what I do with the other PSOs. There's only 100 of us out of 1.5 million. We must stand together. We're pretty unique and special, and we've got to get philanthropy to change. And so doing that as a coalition has been much better than trying to do it alone. And I've seen how that has really advanced us, and would encourage you to do the same. So this has been wonderful. Hopefully you all took away something that encourages you to shift, change, and to just double down on how amazing you are and why you should be supported.
And Susan, what would you like to leave folks with? And while you do that, I'll put up our contact information so people can get to us through our websites, like you said, because they're up and they're running and they're clean. And
important places to begin. Yes, well, thanks. I mean, I guess I'll first say, since you mentioned the website, so many of the issues we've talked about today, I feel like have been filling my inbox for the last 18 months. And so I started recently writing a little monthly article to address the most important ones. So if you want to go to my website and be part of that conversation, I'm very interested in what is vexing everyone and what is challenging everyone, and where we can go from here. I think my takeaway, like Satonya's, is a very positive one. I have heard so many conversations that I really don't think would have taken place between funders and their nonprofit partners. I'm going to adopt that term, Satonya. And they have been so encouraging by and large. I mean, let's acknowledge not everything is perfect at this point. I absolutely agree. We need to keep using a very embracing tone to continue to move things in the right direction. But I think that nonprofits are being heard in a way that we weren't before. We probably still have a lot of pushing to do. And I think what I like to take away as a practical step for all of this is that oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, I feel like as we are looking to raise funds, we're always saying to our potential funders, pick me. And we're raising our hand and trying to do our best to get noticed in all of this. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I want to echo a few threads of what I've heard today, and saying that it is also important for us to pick them, to pick the funders with which we work, because they are our partners. And whether it's because they require too much paperwork, or they're planning to come in and provide advice that maybe is going to not be helpful in the moment in which we're applying for a particular opportunity, I think it's important to really think about the ways in which we are measuring ourselves. I'll put myself with that nonprofit hat on. Is it most important to look at the bottom line always, or what are the other metrics that we are going to adopt for ourselves? And so if you do have an organizational culture that still measures only dollars, I'd say, let's see what we can do as we're moving into the new year to not just budget differently, but also look at performance metrics differently. So we do emphasize cultivation and these other pieces that we've mentioned today as being so important.
Outstanding. Thank you both. I can't thank you enough. And I think that this is a very timely, very needed conversation that happened today. So I appreciate you all coming and sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your enthusiasm, because I think the message that we're walking away from is a positive one. And I would just encourage everyone who has participated in this call, and I'm thankful that we had over 100 organizations represented through our registration, and probably many more at the last minute. And we've got people within those organizations, from CEOs to resource developers to program officers, to the legal teams. So there's this permeation within the organizations who are participating, who are thinking about these things. All up and down, and get that, and make sure you keep those people at the table, because we're going to going to be bold and we're going to be innovative. We have to get more voices to the table. And I say that with the offer of, we're asking, many of you to possibly join us here at the Assembly as well. We want more voices. We're looking for new members, to help leverage and build this groundswell so that we can advocate together, but we can do more of what we're doing here. I hope to see many of you at our future sessions. This is at the core of the programming that we at the Assembly put on. I would ask each of you, there is a survey link in the chat box. If you'd like to see more on this particular subject, or there are things that you think that we would be in a very good position to present, please share that with us. If you want more information on how to join the Assembly, that's in there too. But with that being said, I just want to thank everybody again. I hope everyone's getting prepared for a festive holiday season. It's time to kind of take a break in some areas, and I'm encouraging all of us to do that. And with that, I'd say have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic.
you.